Breaking news out of Turkey, where world leaders, including President Trump, have arrived for a high-stakes NATO summit.
The Ukraine war is among the topics expected to dominate the agenda. Earlier this morning, Mr. Trump held bilateral talks, those are still happening right now, with Turkish President Erdoğan on the sidelines of the summit. The president was asked whether the U.S. would sell F-35 jets to Turkey amid pending legal and congressional hurdles. Take a listen to what he said.
We have a very good relationship. I would think that many people, I can tell you, many people, including the people sitting right here, thinks, why wouldn't we do that? We have a better relationship with Turkey, and Turkey's been in many ways much more loyal than other countries that we think would be loyal. So something certainly we would consider. It's a great plane. It's the best, currently the best plane by far. And it's certainly something we will consider.
For more, let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She is in Turkey. She joins us now with the latest as this is still unfolding. Monica, good morning. So first, let's just start on sort of the significance, just the fact that this is a big moment, that the president is there on the ground in Turkey for the NATO summit, given the tensions that exist with him and several of these leaders and the comments that he's made about United States' partnership, participation in NATO at all.
Exactly, Savannah. This is a critical alliance that certainly has been tested and will continue to be tested throughout this critical summit. And the president said that if it were not for his close relationship with the Turkish president, with President Erdoğan, he may have skipped this altogether, that he felt he wanted to be here in person specifically because of him and the close ties that they have forged. But certainly there is so much on the agenda here, certainly some of that covered in what you just played, with the president talking about this decision about the F-35 jets and selling them to Turkey. The reason that this is a point of contention is that there is a possible issue with the kind of technology that Turkey would use that could make this the kind of thing where it could fall into the wrong hands. That's the concern from the U.S. government's perspective, from the Pentagon's perspective, particularly when it comes to Russia, given the ties between Turkey and Russia and some of the other arms deals and sales that have taken place in the past. So that is one aspect that they will be dealing with. But it's been a persistent question for the president and his White House whether they would go forward with that. But certainly the backdrop to all of this, Savannah, is the ongoing, very fragile ceasefire with Iran, and the fact that this country, where we are here in Turkey, borders that country, and certainly there is a lot of interest here in the region on what could come next. So expect that to be discussed, in addition to the war in Ukraine, that ongoing conflict now stretching nearly into its fifth year here. Remember that that is something that President Trump, as a candidate, promised to bring to an end, to a conclusion, as soon as he took office in this second term, which certainly hasn't happened. But he continues to stress in recent weeks that some kind of a deal could be near. We know that the president spoke with President Putin of Russia in recent days, and he is set to sit down with President Zelensky of Ukraine tomorrow. So they will continue to discuss all of that. Remember that there is still just ongoing, very bloody fighting that we are seeing between Ukraine and Russia. So that is something the president would like to spend some time talking about. In addition to, he has been very critical of some of these European and other NATO countries that he says are not contributing enough when it comes to defense spending. So expect the president to continue to repeat that. Savannah,
Monica, walk us through a little more of what the president's schedule is. Obviously, they have dinner tonight and things really get going tomorrow. And just big picture, what does the U.S. and what does the White House hope to get out of this NATO summit? Knowing some of the past tensions we've seen between the U.S. and other NATO nations, what seems to be the primary goal?
Yeah, and remember that the president has even mused about withdrawing from NATO. Certainly that doesn't seem to be something that he's going to be talking about here, but it's something that he does like to refer to when he is particularly unhappy, even though when you do look at the actual percentages of the GDP of the certain nations that are contributing, they are being made to commit to essentially a 5% defense spending payment, that some of these countries are getting close to more like 2%, but are headed in the right direction. The president still overall, though, feels that more could be done, and he has called out some countries in particular. So that's kind of the backdrop to all of this in terms of what might come out of it and what you might hear from the president. But the head of NATO is essentially arguing that things are headed where they should be, and he has tried to convince President Trump through a method of flattery, really, that we have seen from Mark Rutte, really praising the president's leadership and trying to kind of get him to come along and continue to embrace the alliance. But in terms of schedule, Joe, the president will have that meeting, as I mentioned, with President Zelensky tomorrow. He will also meet with the president of Syria tomorrow, we expect. And there will potentially be some other pull-asides, some other meetings, as often take place when you have global summits like this and other leader meetings where more of them will be together before he returns to Washington tomorrow evening. So it's actually a pretty quick trip for the president. Guys.
All right, Monica Alba from Turkey for us, covering this breaking news as President Trump and Turkish President Erdoğan hold this bilateral meeting to kick off the NATO summit. Monica, thank you very much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.